On that note, I want to thank the chairperson, and in particular my brother, the deputy chairperson of the AUC, even though he travels to all these fancy places like Cuba and, to sort of tie in those links. So as you can see, I'm still jealous of your trip to Cuba, for his presence here today. It's not just your presence here today, but I think that every time that there has been something with the UN family, you have been with us, and the work that you're doing with Dr. Abdallah to make sure that the RCM works and works well for the African Union should not be underestimated. So thank you very much for putting the AU with us in this work. I want to thank everybody else from the African Union Commission as well, because we can talk a lot about it, but if we're not able to work together, it doesn't work. And your presence here today shows that we're having a growing and increasingly good relationship with you, and that is very good. We are gathered here at a time when the African Union has made significant strides with signing the Continental Free Trade Agreement, the CFTA. 44 countries in March signed on to the CFTA in the Extraordinary Summit in Kigali. In addition to signing on to the Continental Free Trade Area agreements, we also signed in Kigali the free movement of persons, and 30 countries signed that. We also launched in January the single African air transport market and the decision on the financing of the union through the imposition of a 0.2% levy on eligible imports by the AU member states, of which 22 countries are already implementing or putting in place the appropriate mechanisms for the implementation. These are very important milestones that the African Union and its member states have been able to make in the last 6 months. I think this is important because it shows that there is momentum in the union. The union is clearly moving as one. I think we don't have here also the work that the union is doing in terms of having a common position on migration, which is a very difficult issue and which looks different to different parts of the continent. But the union has been able to come together and say we are also going to put in a common position on migration, for which there will be an international compact signed in July. I think what this shows is that we have moved from when the union was born and when the ECA, we are celebrating our 60th anniversary this year, was created, where we were still struggling to define how do African institutions create the kinds of institutions that are needed to just govern the people. How do we come out of this sort of Pan-African political struggle? We have now resolutely gone into a space where we are talking about the economics. How can the continent become an economic powerhouse? How can the continent become the deliverer of jobs, the deliverer of prosperity, the creator of wealth? And I think the Pan-Africanism that we are now talking about today is a Pan-Africanism that is resolutely economics. It is a Pan-Africanism that says Africa will become strong and Africa will become one if Africa economically can stand toe-to-toe with its other continental partners. And I think that as part of that process, the Africa EU-AU meetings, which the AU so excellently well chaired, I think it's part of that process that shows that as a continent, there is now an African economic voice that can actually speak as one. So all this CFTA, free movement, single air transport, the levy, I think are indications that not only do we recognize the importance of the economics, but we are actually taking measures to begin to put them in place. This also comes at a time when global growth for Africa looks good, but it's not as strong as we would like it to be. We are coming out of a phase in Africa's growth where we have been growing sustainably for about average 6% between 2002 and 2012. And then there was a dip. And now we celebrate 3.1%, but 3.1% is not good enough. We're projecting 3.9% in 2018 and 2019 going forward. That still is not good enough because we know that as the continent is growing and as we're creating, our populations are increasing, we need a lot more to be able to meet the basic challenges of our populations, invest in the infrastructure that is needed, and ensure that we're providing all the public goods that the vulnerable need on the continent. And I think that is why we are here today, is to see how we can pull together our different strands of competence, our different areas of expertise, and put it at the service of the continent to ensure that collectively we are actually being able to produce that material difference on the continent that is so desperately needed in this, at this moment. We remain optimistic. It's only 3.9%. We hope and we believe that we can go from 3.9% growth to 6 to even 8 and possibly 10 that is needed. We're sitting in Addis Ababa and it's growing at 8%. It has an average growth rate in the last 6-7 years of about 11%. The good news of some of these numbers is that it shows that it's possible. It shows that with good policies, with determination and excellent leadership, one can actually achieve some of these numbers that are so desperately needed. So I think coming here to Addis is just in itself a sign of some of the good work that is happening on the continent. We know from statistics from UN Habitat that there are about 187 million people that live in cities. We know from the same statistics that we have a deficit of about 35 million home constructions yearly. So in some sense, there is a demand on one side, but why are we not being able to fill all of this is because we're not creating the kind of wealth that is needed. And I think as we begin to do the work, and as our colleagues in UNESCO and other of the UN institutions working on education continue to strengthen the work that we're doing on education, we hope that we can begin to prepare an African youth that is ready for the future. This also means that we need to continue doing some more work on science and technology, on innovation, on reducing the cost of physical infrastructure. Even if we pass the single air transport policies, we still know that it's very difficult to have open skies on the continent. It's very difficult to talk about growth if we are not pushing some of the policies that come behind making this effectively work. And so it is with these things that we hope that our different institutions that are working on these issues, WTO, UNCTAD, as well, that are here, can come together. And this is really the purpose of these meetings, is to see how we all come together with our different expertise to make some of these issues that we are struggling with more relevant and easier to solve as they can appear as huge challenges for us. A fourth big mega trend is the climate change. And again, the question around climate change and corruption, and people may say, how do you put that together? And it's very easy. It's one around just even how we design our cities, how our contracts for housing and corporate contracts given, how our land contracts given. I think we talk a lot about the Sahel. There is a big question around land ownership in the Sahel and around pastoralism and how that is done. How are the processes being managed? And I think in every sphere of your jobs, the question of corruption is holding us back. And I think that is why the African Union decided, and I'm also on record in saying this, normally we say governance or we say something that doesn't sound like corruption to talk about it. But I think this time the African Union has sort of put the elephant and said there is an elephant in the room, it's corruption, we're going to call it corruption, we're going to talk about it. So for us as the UN, we're very happy because it gives us a space to come in and just talk about it without sort of dancing around the corners and trying to manage how we do this. We're going to have about 30 elections in the next 18 months on the continent. And there we know that when you have elections, the whole question of governance becomes a particularly important element. And in areas where you have weak corruption, elections or a semblance or an attempt for democracy can get even weaker if we cannot manage the processes well. So again, but this is I think a sphere where the African Union has done a lot of work by, you have made all this progress on coup d'etats. We're now waiting for you to make progress on changing constitutions, because that's part of the corruption discussion. We are not doing well enough to be able to manage climate change. And a lot of this is happening because our institutions are not strong enough and there is corruption in the process. So I think if we look at these four areas and at the end of the day, then you see and you agree with me, 3.9% is not good enough. We need much bigger, faster growth to be able to invest in ensuring that we can move forward. We are meeting at a time when multilateralism is increasingly facing significant challenges. We just came from London with the Secretary General, where a big conversation was around, he talked a lot about the book by Graham Allison, Destined for War, and the whole question was around when you start having transitions and shifts in power on the continent and in the world, then are we headed for a new crisis? I had the opportunity to listen to Graham Allison, who is a Harvard professor and has written this book about shifting dynamics and different weights of them in the United States and China, and whether really we should be thinking about going towards a new era of crisis. I think the issue is around trade, and Africa today is a lot in the trade dimension. We're talking about the CFTA, we're talking about AGOA, we're talking about the ACP, we're talking about the free trade area agreements within the continent. So in a moment when there is a lot of questioning around the importance of multilateralism, about the importance of public goods and coming together, I think Africa is demonstrating that we believe that as a continent, working together, we will be stronger. And that's a good sign, but we cannot do it alone. We still need the rest of the global governance system to work with us. And I think in that occasion, WTO was telling us about the importance of making sure and strengthening the work of WTO. And as WTO regional offices, I think working with the African Union and the rest of the UN family to ensure that as we do the CFTA and as we talk about renegotiating AGOA and the ACP, we are still consistent with some of these multilateral norms is an important process. And for that, I think it's very important that we continue to do that. Of course, on Agenda 2030 and the Paris Agreement, there is some strain, but there is no continent that is more affected by climate change. So whether we like it or not, as a continent, we have to work on it. We have to think about it, and we have to do something about it. At ECA and working with UNEP and a few of our other partners, we've done a lot of work to show that it could actually be a positive. Energy today could be much cheaper if we use renewable energy. Senegal just launched, I think, what is today the cheapest cost of solar energy in the world at 3.2 cents. Thinking that many of our countries are still paying 30 cents for energy. That differential is quite important. It goes back to growth, it goes back to jobs. So I think that, again, there are positives. On the housing side, UN Habitat, there are all these new technologies for housing that can work and make sure that we can grow. And I think that that's what we need to take to the African Union and see how we can work with our African Union commissioners that are working on these issues to ensure that we move forward. Coming to the House a little bit, there is the reform. I think Mr. Mane talked about it. We're very happy. At least the reform of the Secretariat and the UNDG reform went through on Monday. The UNGA approved the establishment of regional commissions that should allow us to be able to work in a more systematic and cohesive way as the Secretary General will want. And so in this context at the regional level, with that reform now in place, the RCM becomes an even more important vehicle. The DSG herself would have liked to come to Addis, and she sends her greetings and her regards, and of course, as part of this reform process, and as we all know, it was coming down to the wire, so it was very difficult to get her early commitment. She was trying to see whether she could come in today and be back in New York, as Dr. Hamdok knows, but it was not possible. But I think she wanted to show how she believes her belief in this group and the importance of it. We know that the SDGs at the end of the day are Africa. If Africa meets the SDGs will be successful. So really, I think that whole process of the reform that is being underway now is to see how we can make sure that Africa can deliver on the SDGs and do it in a way that works. Now that the reforms have gone through, I think we have a little bit more space to design how we will work together, how we can complement the divisions of labor with the regional economic commissions and the rest of the UNDG group, and make sure that there is a system that works well. For the regional economic commissions, of course, in the context of the reform, it was agreed that we will take up 3 tasks. One is a convening function, which is what we're doing here today. Second is a think tank function, which is doing a lot of work with you on trying to do the analysis of what are the challenges of the continent, but also what are the solutions and how we can implement them. And finally is the operational function, which is basically to see how we can do some more capacity development with you. As part of that process, and I think that it is nowhere evident than from the Secretary General himself, the importance that he places on the SDGs, but on the fact that if the SDGs succeed in Africa, they will succeed. And I think that immediately he took on his mandate, he came to Africa, he came to the African Union, and he said, there is no way that we can do this without a partnership with the African Union. And we were very grateful, and he is eternally grateful and continues to be, that the African Union was very open to saying, yes, we can work on a development framework with the African Union that will ensure that everything that we do as the UN family will be consistent with the frameworks that are being developed in the African Union. And to begin that, with many of you, we did the first report, which was led by Joe, which basically was able to map the SDGs and Agenda 2063, and show that when we talk about the SDGs and or we talk about Agenda 2063, we are basically talking about the same things. And I think what was interesting was that the SDGs were 169, and Agenda 2063 was 167. See, so you guys are better than us in terms of many, many things. But we had all these indicators when you reopen the two agendas, and we were able to put them together. And I think this is particularly powerful because it means that we can actually work. And if you haven't seen the report, maybe we will have some copies during the day, or we will give you soft copies. But it's very important because you can really see the matches of the two agendas and how intricately linked they are. And it allows us then to be able to confidently and comfortably talk about either one of those agendas interchangeably. But more importantly, it shows to the African Union, and this work was done in coordination with the African Union, the African Development Bank, OSA, I think all of us, UNDP, WTO, we reached out to everybody to make sure that we were doing those marches, and the NEPAD agencies as well. So what that did was now we have a new framework for that. The SG decided, no, I want to go forward. The SG had signed in April an MOU with the African Union on peace and security. But, Haile is here, and Haile did a lot of the work with his team on that. And after that he said, you know, what if we do something a little bit big, and I don't see Fink, but he will be in the room, maybe he was also invited, because they are the ones then on the front line of some of the work, was to say there is peace and security, but of course, particularly when you look at areas like the Sahel, there is no way that you can talk about peace and security without talking about development. When you look at the Horn of Africa, there is no way you can talk about peace and security without talking about the Sahel. When you look at the Lake Chad area basin, there is no way you can talk about peace and security without talking about the Sahel. So he decided, I want to do a development agreement as well. So we put ourselves to work, and with DESA also as sort of taking the lead on some of this work, and our teams, Ida and the rest here, one at the AU Commission, the chairperson and the deputy chairperson under their leadership. Finally, in January, we signed the partnership framework. So we now have an official partnership framework, and I think we have some nice little booklets which you should have, or we'll give you copies of it. The next step of that now is really to say, and why are we meeting here, is to say, how can we operationalize that? It's one thing to sign it, it's another thing to sort of put it into action. A lot of work has gone on, and I think that was some of the work that was being done in Nairobi, was to see how can we now put that into action? What is the framework for operationalizing it? The SG is going to be back on the continent in January. We will have to show some results. There's some work going on migration, there's some work going on, I think, on the health side, with UNAIDS, and then there is work going on with UN Women. But I think we'll have to open up some of that and see where are the quick wins that we can give the SG and the AU Commissioner to say, yes, this partnership is really working and it's worth the trouble. So I think really that is what we are here today to do, is to find out, one, how can we strengthen the UNDG to ensure that we deliver for Africa? And as a part of operationalizing that question of the how, we already have the UN AU framework, which is now saying how can we find a few key implementable actions that we can take that will show that we can actually translate this framework into something that is action-oriented, that is measurable, and most importantly, that delivers for the African citizens, and particularly for its youth. So once again, thank you very much, and I look forward to a long and interesting day of deliberations.